place exists by the grace of God. Nobody can find anything like it.
Right.
To have a space to come out to and garden and get into the soil is very rewarding.
They loved doing
Yes,
it. They loved
it was
yeah.
a labor of love. It
Yeah.
truly was.
Yeah.
This is the story about two men who decided to change their small corner of the world in Sunnyside, Queens. The friends who joined them and the people who carry on their work. The year was 1971. Roderick Trounson, a resident of the Phipps building in Sunnyside, had grown tired of the view from his living room window. The 50th Street and Barnett Avenue borders of the Sunnyside Park had become an illegal dumping ground. It was not unusual to see a soiled mattress or an old toilet bowl poking up from beneath the huge weeds that grew along the fence of the baseball field. Rather than complaining to the city, Rod took it upon himself to change all that. Initially, his intention was simply to clean up the corner at 50th and Barnett. Maybe he'd plant some flowers. Little did he know what would grow here. Shortly after he started, Rod's friend Paul Vitolo got involved. From his living room, Paul could see the promise and value of Rod's efforts.
Shortly after Rod started, Paul joined him, and then,
Right.
and
Okay.
we were friends. They were friends before we were even married.
Oh, really?
So, and Pat and Rod at that time lived in the apartment directly above mine.
Oh, really?
So between the garden connection and everything, then
Yeah.
we were neighbors, so we became
Wow. Very good
very
friends.
close.
To discourage dog owners from using the freshly cleared area as new dumping ground, Rod's wife Pat thought she'd heard somewhere that dogs didn't like the scent of marigolds. And so the first flowers planted were orange and yellow marigolds. Neither Rod nor Paul was a gardener, but they learned as they went along. At one point, when they were particularly unsure of what they were doing, Paul said, "We can't go wrong because it can't look worse than it was." Fueled by their growing passion and encouraged by their progress, they just kept going up 50th Street towards 39th Avenue. Their neighbors started to show interest. Plots were sectioned off and assigned. Pat Trounson remembers kids frequently knocking at the door, looking for Rod so they could go out to help. There was no age minimum set, and many children had plots of their own. It was great fun, she remembered. Soon there was a waiting list for plots. To try to accommodate these hopeful gardeners, the project started to snake around the corner of Barnett Avenue. The first phase of this cleanup project was very physically demanding. The men spent countless back-breaking days hacking away at the scrubby, tree-like weeds that held a firm grip on the land.
Well, I think one of the reasons it took so long to clear out, too, not only were people dumping stuff, was a very rocky area, and they would dig up quite large boulders, and that had to be, gotten rid of somehow, and it was a very tedious, slow work.
Roy Rowland was just one of the many friends who lent their time and muscle to further the progress. In fact, a lot of the men who did the heavy physical work never even had their own plots. They just wanted to help out. More hacking and hauling, clearing and carting ensued, making way for what would become the vegetable gardens. Most of the people who did take plots were not experienced gardeners either, and they had to teach themselves how to grow vegetables. In 1974, Roderick Trounson received a certificate of award from the president of the Borough of Queens for his efforts to enhance and beautify his neighborhood. The man who didn't wait for someone else to do it was recognized for his hard work. It must have made him feel really good to get that letter in the mail. But it must have been much better to just look out his window and enjoy the new view. In 1979, the Trounsons moved to Texas. It is very hard to imagine Rod saying goodbye to his lovely gardens, but he left them in the good hands of his friend Paul Vitolo. A few years after moving to Texas, Roderick Trounson passed away. The 80s marched on, and Paul continued to be a vital force as a steward of the land. As the number of participants grew, Paul came up with the idea of creating a gathering area where people could rest a bit, eat, drink, and enjoy their new surroundings. He built the area out of boulders they'd cleared and cobblestones he collected from countless building sites. In fact, Paul built most of the stone walls and borders in the garden. He laid the paths and even built a little stone waterfall for the runoff of excess water.
Even laying all these stones, as I say, I think my husband pretty much did the
He did the whole
as
thing.
far
He
as I
did,
know.
yeah.
And he would always, if he saw the Belgian blocks or those cobblestones. Unfortunately, at that time we had an old car, but the car would almost be tilted up because he had
Really?
the trunk so loaded with
Wow.
the
That is
cobblestones.
funny. That is funny. They're
And
so
any building
beautiful.
sites he would jump to, because then, he knew you could always, they'd give him stuff from the building site.
Really.
It was this new gathering area which became the soul of the garden. Gardeners and friends of the garden often met and hung out here, and it became a hub of activity.
The men would be doing
Impromptu.
heavy-duty work. They'd get hot and they'd go get some beer and bring it down and start with that. And then the women would scurry home and bring down their dips and whatever. And then it just became, that was our social life. Every single Sunday,
Wow, that sounds like so
we
much
had a
fun.
party. There would be 25, 30 people easily.
Really?
Easily.
Wow.
But not every Sunday. Some it was just a small group.
Sometimes, but I mean, by and large, I remember for most of those
Yeah.
years, it would be 25, 30 people. That's what I miss the most. is-
Really?
is
The
this-
parties?
The social end
Yeah,
of it,
the
yeah.
social end,
Yeah,
because you could
yeah.
come down here anytime there'd be people here,
Really.
so
Yeah.
it was like a carryover from the days when we were younger in the
Right.
park,
Right.
So like our whole social life was right here
Yeah.
for so many
That's
years.
so amazing.
Yeah. Those are good times.
Yeah.
By the mid-90s, Paul started to have health problems. Gradually, he needed to withdraw from his post at the helm, and other gardeners stepped in to help carry on his work.
A lot of people over the years have put a lot
Right.
of work into
Right.
it.
Paul Vitolo passed away in 2000. One can imagine what a sad period must have followed after Paul's death.
Different people have stepped in at the right time
Right.
to
Right.
keep it going, so that's wonderful. It's a tribute to both of them.
Mary Caulfield was one of those people. She held a sort of unofficial post as a manager.
Really a labor of love. It called to me
Right,
and to
right.
Jean Auger, who isn't with us anymore, and it was just endlessly interesting, just entertaining creativity and building, and it was just lovely. It's difficult for people to understand. It's not a business. It's not a fraternal organization. It's not a lot of things, but exactly what it is hard to explain.
Right. Right.
You need to experience,
Right, yeah.
but it's so beautiful
Yeah.
when you understand
Right,
it that it's
right.
really worth telling.
Yeah.
I think.
Another person who contributed his talents to the garden was an artist from Canada named Jean Auger. Here, he found a new outlet for his creativity where he could express himself using the earth instead of paint. This primitive mask, which he'd carved from a tree stump, finally disintegrated after years of constant exposure to the elements. This sculpture, which he'd made from found objects, remains, though, and watches over his former plot. He was a passionate man who loved things to be big and bright, like the elephant ears and Mexican sunflowers he planted. When Jean became too sick to work anymore, he guided Peter Coyne to complete the patio area beyond the arbor.
He was on in years, but he would come here every day and we would really chat, and he was just a wonderful, wonderful man. And the gardens kind of stopped right here, if you will, where I am now. And I started placing some stones down, and he was motivating me because he couldn't do it anymore, and he was really a very autistic man, to where to place and sooner or later I found myself building this patio here out of the rocks, and also the planter to kind of finish the garden off at this point, past the grape arbor. For me, Jean was very crucial to my involvement here because he was such a nice man, very autistic.
Jean passed away in 2004. Looking at these photos, it is very easy to forget that this garden flourished for 33 years without a direct water source. When Peter Coyne became involved here, he changed that.
Peter got us water. That was the biggest.
That was the biggest
really?
thing, yes.
He got
Really?
us water.
So you didn't have water before?
No, what we did is we had, for a while, we had a license to use the pump.
Permit.
The permit, rather, to use the pump there. And then we would fill up our buckets and drag it up here. I mean,
Really?
it was heavy-duty
Well,
work.
that's why they.
I decided that it wouldn't be too hard to put a water system in, a simple water system that would help this garden to flourish and help the flowers to bloom and vegetables and make everybody's life easier instead of carrying water cans from barrels.
Right.
And so about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I just hooked a line up to tennis, and now we have water.
Wow.
Three different watering points in the garden, and that helps especially for the months of August, where it gets very hot, and all the plants need a lot of water.
Yeah.
So.
For a long time, I've been a committed urbanite. The concrete jungle and all of its glitter sustained me through my 20s just fine. No one would have ever called me the outdoorsy type. But when my son was born, I really started to crave outdoor space. Not a sprawling lawn, just a little patch of ground where I could try to plant some herbs and maybe some flowers. I wanted to find somewhere that my son could be outside and watch nature and learn from it. So when I had a chance to rent a plot in this garden, I jumped at it. As soon as I set foot beyond the gate, I feel lighter. Weeding and sifting stones down on my hands and knees, I immediately relax. The cares of the world seem a little further away, and it's just a great time to think things through. I marvel at my luck to have finally found a small piece of earth that I can work for a little while. I never met the men who created this place so many years ago, but I feel as though I have. They are gone now. But when I walk these pathways, I feel their presence, and I thank them.
I'm falling in love with a memory of people, of places I've never seen.